Stop bitching, have yourself a revolution.
Don't let free speech go up in smoke, man.
The world's leading jailer, the United States of America.
I want to be a hippie god against no marijuana.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
How the hell are you, Buzzy, man?
Yeah, I'm doing good, Willie. How you doing, sir?
All right, man. I got something for you right up my sleeve here. Let's see what we got.
What you got there?
Well, we're going to play a little guessing game. Right here it says what I'm talking about, okay? It's the only known plant, all right? The only one in the world that can be grown from the equator, all right, to the Arctic Circle, to the Antarctic Circle, all right, from the mountains to the valleys, you know, and from the oceans, you know, to the plains, you know what I'm saying? And including arid lands and, you know, everywhere in between. Now, see this plant I'm talking about, it's the healthiest plant for the ground. Out of the 300,000 plants and the subspecies, the millions of subspecies, you see. And, well, anyway, you gotta understand, it has a root system, people. I mean, this root system, it grows 10 to 12 inches in 30 days compared to 1 inch with rye barley grass. And its roots penetrate up to 6 feet deep, pulverizing the soil and making it arable. It's the King Kong of all plants and plant life. You got anything you could say? You got a guess?
Oh, no, absolutely not, man. There ain't no plant like that. You're lying. You're making that up.
It's God's favorite plant on the planet.
I don't believe you, man. I think you're making it up.
Come on.
Geez, I don't know, man. Could it be cannabis, hemp, marijuana?
Stop!
Did I win? Yeah! Did I save the planet?
I am the cosmic Argonaut people, and I travel both through space and through time. And I'm going to tell you the key to it all, people. It's just to keep an open mind. You got that? All right. Now, Buzzy, tell the people what we're going to be doing with. I am Psilly Willy. We are the Department of Freedom. Here to stop bitching and to start a revolution. Because this thing's going down in this country. If you've been watching Food for Thought Wednesdays at 9 o'clock here on Nutmeg, you've been getting an earful. You've been getting plenty of food for thought. Let me tell you something, people. We're happy to be here at Nutmeg Studios with my fine friends helping us out here, right here. And we're bringing it to you. What are we bringing them this week, buddy?
I'll tell you what we're bringing you tonight, folks. We're bringing you back to the garden where it all began. That's right. Grow yourself a garden like this in this state, folks, for recreational, medicinal, or nutritional purposes. And guess where you'll end up? In prison. That's right. Stop bitching. Start a revolution. Join the Department of Freedom for the next half hour, beautiful people. America's war against its own citizens, known as the war on drugs, is on trial. And the verdict is in. Know this, people, that the drug war is a fraud, an intentional deception to cause a person to give up property or some lawful right. First up on tonight's program, we're going to view a speech from Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee. Hear what he has to say concerning America's longest ongoing war. Check it out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past Friday, the United States would have observed, celebrated would be entirely the wrong word, the 40th anniversary of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was initiated by President Richard Nixon, and he said we could have a war on drugs 40 years ago. And the fact is, 40 years later, we've spent nearly $1 trillion on the war on drugs. We have just as much drug use in this country as ever before. We've incarcerated millions and millions of people for victimless crimes. And when we get people who sell drugs, which we need to do, all that happens is like a shark's teeth. They're replaced by the next in line, somebody else wanting to make money from a program that the public endorses and supports. So the war on drugs has been a terrible mistake. Now, don't get the wrong impression. I'm not suggesting that drug abuse and drug addiction is not a great problem that we must deal with. But our approach in treating it as a law enforcement matter and not as a health matter, a health care issue, has led to prison populations increasing, Racial disparities of the greatest source in this nation in the arrest process, and a lost generation of people with no education and no job prospects because those arrests haunt them for the rest of their lives. Think about how many law enforcement resources have been wasted on drug arrests, nonviolent drug arrests, when policemen could be spending their time working against violent crime and crimes that are dangerous to people, robberies and murders and assaults and other offenses that are truly important to the American public. It has been estimated that the total criminal justice cost of marijuana arrests for state and local governments is as much as $7.6 billion a year. That averages out to about $10,000 per arrest. Think of all the serious criminals that could have been arrested instead. I was shocked recently to read that the New York City Police Department arrested 50,000 people for low-level marijuana offenses last year. New York City, 50,000 arrests for low-level marijuana offenses, more than during a 19-year period between 1978 and 1996 combined. Marijuana use has not skyrocketed in the last year, but arrests have vamped up. And they use arrest as a basis to get people, particularly people of color, where it's 7 times more likely you'll be arrested if you're African American, and 4 times more likely you'll be arrested if you're Latino, and more likely if you're African American Latino that you'll spend a night in jail than if you're Caucasian, as a way to take people and arrest them and deprive them of what should be their basic civil rights to go around the city. Our local budgets are straining like never before, and yet we see more arrests. It's time that we question this policy, this war, and knowing that insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. This is insane. For 40 years, we've had this war on drugs. We've had a war on our own citizens. We've wasted monies that could be used for better things, and we treated what is a health problem and a societal problem as a law enforcement problem. It is a mistake, and we need to change our approach. Drug courts have been a successful way to deal with this problem. We have drug courts in my community that have been successful in getting people to see a different approach to life. Not a jail, but a different approach. Racial disparities, as I mentioned, has been tremendous. 7 times more likely if you're African American, 4 times more likely if you're Latino to be arrested. These inequities run throughout our drug policy program and need to be corrected. We corrected a disparity between crack and cocaine, powder cocaine and crack, last year. It was 100 to 1 before we changed the law. It's now 18 to 1 in quantity. Still, it should be equal, and it results in racial disparities once again. I've introduced legislation, the Justice Integrity Act, which would study those disparities, and a Burn Program Accountability Act, which would require states to do studies on their racial disparities. The fact is, law enforcement makes arrests for these crimes sometimes to justify getting burn funds and getting funds from the federal government for the purpose of getting money into their programs and not providing justice. We need to have expungement laws so that people who have had nonviolent drug offenses can have their records expunged and go on and have a life, get employment, and a successful life in America. I've introduced the Fresh Start Act that says if you have a nonviolent offense, federal offense, and you spent 7 years and had a clean life, you can get your record expunged. This needs to become the law and give people a second chance. Otherwise, they can't get jobs and they resort to crime. Medical marijuana is an issue that's come up in this country, and most states that have had the opportunity to deal with it have passed it, mostly by percentages of over 60%. I had a good friend named Oral James Mitchell. Oral James Mitchell was a Navy SEAL and one of the strongest, toughest, best friends I ever had. When OJ was 54, he got pancreatic cancer. And pancreatic cancer destroys a person, just whittles them away. And a guy who was 210 pounds who could do all those things the SEALs do, the hand-to-hand and the paratroops and he used medical marijuana, and his mother said, thank God for the marijuana. It allowed Oral to have a sense of humor and to eat. It worked. I yield back the balance of my time and urge us to solve the war on crimes, the war on drugs, by getting out of it. It is a war. It is a crime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And there you have it, folks. You heard it. People in Congress have said it, and people in Congress have heard it. The war on drugs is nothing but a mistake. It's insane, and it is a crime. So says Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee. Go, Steve! What you're presently viewing, folks, is a huge crop of cannabis that is about to be eradicated by the Mexican government. What a waste of a precious natural resource, folks. Not to mention the waste of human resources necessary to uproot and burn the weed. Oh my God. Next up on the program, beautiful people, we have for you an interview with our friends from Reason TV. That's right. We're going to hear from retired Major Neill Franklin, who happens to be the President Executive Director at Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, here on Stop Bitchin', Start a Revolution.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Major Neill Franklin, retired from the Maryland State Police. He's also the Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, a group of cops, law enforcement people, active and retired, who fight against the drug war and its policies. Neill, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
You guys have created a great study that's online at LEAP's website. And you delivered a copy of this to Gil Kurlikowski, the current drug czar. What are you trying to accomplish?
One of the first things we wanted to do was put together a comprehensive look at those past 4 decades, which will focus upon financial cost, human cost, addiction.
Neill, you were at a certain point in your career, you were a drug warrior, and that changed. What happened to flip you on this issue?
When I retired in 1999, I went to work for the Baltimore Police Department. And just a few months after my retirement date, I had a conversation with a comrade of mine, Edward Totley. He was telling me about a case he was working. He was going to make one final buy of cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer. He was working with the FBI on a task force right here in DC. And as we've had in the past, we've had these conversations, and we didn't, we weren't thinking about the inherent danger or the possible danger. October 30th, I got a phone call late one night, woke me up, and it was a coworker saying that Ed Totley had been shot. Excuse me. So my wife and I get into the car, and we drive down to PG General Hospital, and it's too late. What had happened when the dealer, Ed had driven the dealer to the location to get the drugs. The dealer came back to the car supposedly with the drugs. And he paused for a moment to extinguish his cigarette, and as soon as he did that, he reached in the car and shot Ed Totley at point blank range in the head. And it was that moment, that night and those weeks after and those months after, where I just said, what are we doing? And I started thinking about the other officers that I knew that had died. And just a couple of years after that, more officers in Baltimore City were dying from drug crime. Dealers, the prohibition part. And that's when I made my turn. That's when I stumbled across LEAP's website when looking for this information and this research, trying to find others who think like I do.
What is the best way to honor the death of Officer Totley and people like him?
The best way that we can honor them is to completely dismantle this system of prohibition and implement a new system focused on treatment and education, period. We know it. We know that needs to be done. Why don't we just do it?
What are the big round numbers or the findings of the war on drugs? What has it been doing, and how has it been affecting American society?
When we first started the war on drugs, we only had a few 100,000 people in prison. Today, we're somewhere around 2.5 million people in prison. Over those 40 years, we've put over 39 million people in prison, and the vast majority of those are from nonviolent drug offenses.
So that's things like simple possession or low-level dealing.
Low-level dealing, right. We're not talking about kingpins, and even though we've arrested a few. We're looking at $1.3 trillion spent on law enforcement efforts. We're talking about cops, judges, judicial system, and prisons. That's quite costly. When you look at the number of bodies, look at Mexico. Over the past 5 years alone, since we stepped up efforts in assisting Mexico in fighting back against the cartel, you're looking at over, I think the number's like 38,000 people murdered at the hands of the cartel. In Venezuela, it's even more. In our very own country, in our neighborhoods and in our communities, every year, somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 people murdered at the hands of our neighborhood gangs.
Why do police chiefs push back against the drug war as it's currently constituted? What's it doing to their efforts to actually control crime?
You have to think about the history of how local police got involved in this in the first place. It came from the federal government in the form of funding. Sometimes I use we bribed into getting into this war. Many police agencies now continue to balance their budgets through federal funds, through grants, burn grants, and what have you. And to lose that money would be significant, and you will hear some police chiefs speak to that. And
yet they're against the war on drugs.
Well, they say that it's failed, that it's not working. They just haven't taken the next step to move away from it, to really end it. And so they feel pressured politically, and sometimes you can't blame them, but because they care about their jobs. Politically, they're pressured to toe the federal party line.
What are the things that we can do quickly and immediately to redress that, to start fixing it and get out of this war mentality?
Well, immediately, where you don't need any legislative action whatsoever, the president can move marijuana from a Schedule I category down to a 3 or 4.
And that would mean, currently marijuana is scheduled under federal drug classifications as having no medical value whatsoever.
And then that's already been proven wrong with the 15 states that are now moving in medical marijuana, and with the many doctors behind that. But in doing that, in completely removing it from the schedule system whatsoever, then he gives the authority then to the states to move and to begin to develop models to manage marijuana within their communities. And the next important thing is it's now time for a discussion, not a debate. That's been done. A discussion as to what are the best possible models? How can we manage these dangerous drugs within our communities? We already know that prohibition does not work, so now we have to regulate and control. Let's have the discussion, come up with some solutions.
We've also been down this road before. In the 70s, we heard stories that Philip Morris had trademarked names like Acapulco Gold and Maui Wowie, anticipating the legalization of marijuana. Jimmy Carter seemed to be weeks away before a big scandal broke and pulled back from legalizing drugs in any way, shape, or form. Other countries have decriminalized. Portugal has decriminalized drugs. But are we actually at a different stage of the discussion over the drug war?
Completely different than back in the 70s for a number of reasons. Number one, we didn't have the data that we have today. Prison numbers, financial numbers, body count, we didn't have those numbers. When you look at the leaders from Mexico, the former presidents have come out with the commission just a couple weeks ago in their report.
Yeah, we have people running for the Republican presidential nomination, people like Gary Johnson and Ron Paul calling for the legalization of drugs.
But here's another significant part. They didn't have LEAP. They didn't have Law Enforcement Against Prohibition back in the 70s. And we're making a significant difference because we bring a completely different perspective. We've been on the front lines, we've been out there in this battle, and we can speak from that perspective, letting people know that this is a complete failure.
What is the best way both for civilians and law enforcement to find out more about LEAP?
Well, they can go to copssaylegalizedrugs.com, and we have a brand new website up, very comprehensive with some very good information, and they really should visit that site.
Major Neill Franklin, retired Maryland State Police, Executive Director of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Nick.
I'm Nick Gillespie for Reason TV.
And there you have it, folks. Words of wisdom from retired Major Neill Franklin, the present Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP. That's right, folks. As you know, people, here on Stop Bitchin' Start a Revolution, the war on us, the people, also known as the American Drug War, it is on trial here, people. That's right. Tonight, we have heard from a congressman making sense of the failed policies of a 40-plus year war on drugs being waged on American citizens and citizens around the world. Indeed. We have heard from leadership in law enforcement. And what do they say? They say that we must end the war on drugs and legalize drugs. Next up, folks, we're going to hear from our friends, the Young Turks, as they identify the main obstacles to achieving sound drug policy here in America. Always remember this, folks, if you want to know what's up, follow the money trail. Check it out.
One thing that isn't talked about enough when it comes to the war on drugs is the big business behind it. Now, I bring this up today because it turns out that there are two separate government studies that were done into the war on drugs, and the government studies found that the Obama administration cannot justify the amount of money we are spending on the war on drugs. No big surprise, right? So, of course, we all know that it's costing us billions of dollars, right? But where does that money really go? Well, just like the wars that we're fighting in the Middle East, a lot of the money goes to private contractors. And these private contractors are paid to teach our law enforcement how they can enforce this war on drugs.
And I have to be honest with you, I did not know that private contractors were involved in this. And so I found this article to be incredibly interesting. It's from the Los Angeles Times. And apparently, even during the Obama administration, we've given over $3 billion to private contractors to go to foreign governments and teach them about how to fight the war on drugs, which is an awesome joke, because what do we know about fighting the war on drugs? The war on drugs is a total and abysmal failure, and the amount of drugs coming in is just the same as it was before, no matter how many people we arrest.
And of course, who's involved whenever it comes to private contractors making billions of dollars? DynCorp. Okay, the same people who funded boccebazi little boys to go to these terrible, disgusting people in Afghanistan, these pedophiles that would take advantage of these people, they would bankroll these boccebazi parties, right? Now, our government paid them $1.1 billion between 2005 and 2009 just so they can teach other countries about the war on drugs and how they can deal with illegal drug trafficking.
And of course, it's not just DynCorp, it's all the defense contractors. And as soon as I saw the list, I was like, of course! Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, ITT, ARINC. So all these guys making all these billions of dollars. And then as I saw that, I was like, well, of course we're never going to stop the war on drugs. These guys are making billions off the war on drugs. Now that gives you your answer. Look, you know, some people have the theory that it's the alcohol companies that don't want the competition, etc. And there's some evidence to back that up, given what the alcohol companies do on ballot measures. When pot's up for legalization, they usually fight it, etc. But to me, this is the much better example, and people who make more money specifically in fighting this nonsense war on drugs.
We spent $6.1 billion on these private contractors between 2005 and 2009. $6.1 billion on the private contractors alone.
Flushed down the toilet. Of absolutely no use whatsoever. The thing is, everybody in government not only has to recognize, they do recognize it. Claire McCaskill, senator, was part of these new reports that Anna's talking about, or commented on the reports. You've got these, the international report that just came out the other day as well, from all the former leaders of Mexico, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera.
Right,
Kofi Annan, the Global Commission, Kofi Annan, former head of the UN. In fact, former Republican George Shultz worked for Ronald Reagan. Former Fed chair Paul Volcker, all these people. War on drugs is an abysmal failure. They all agree. But nonetheless, we have wasted $6.1 billion just in that stretch of time. Why? Because somebody had to get rich.
Well, there you have it, folks. Now, you know, I know, Grandma knows, Congress knows, and law enforcement certainly knows that the war on drugs is a fraud. We live in a culture, folks, that seeks profits over people. Corporations profit while people are imprisoned and suffer the consequences of unjust drug laws. No justice, no peace. I say people over profits. That's right. Anywho, folks, it's time to say goodnight. I'm going to leave you with the Psychedelic Mushroom song by none other than me, Psilly Willy. Be well, folks, and stop bitching, start a revolution.
Come on, people, won't you?
Mushrooms.
Come on. Yeah. Yeah. See, I am just a psychedelic mushroom spore, flying high high up in the clear blue sky. See, I am just a psychedelic mushroom spoon. Yeah, people, flying high in the clear blue sky. Sometimes under the moon and stars, sometimes under the sunshine, people now. Yeah. Yeah, people. So you see, people, I hope and I pray, yeah, I'm gonna grow up and be a sacred mushroom one day, yeah. And then I'm gonna hope and then I'm gonna pray, yeah, people. Some good soul will come along now and pick me, man, put me down, put me right in the belly, yeah, 'cause I'll tell you why. Then I'm gonna get inside your blood, whoa, yeah. But travel up through the blood barrier of your brain. Things might get a little bit different now. Let me tell you now. Things might get a little bit insane. A little bit insane. Come on. You know why? You might see God, man, you might see the devil. I'll tell you one thing that's for sure, man. Ain't never gonna see things on the same old level now. Come on. You know what I'm talking about. Come on, women, people.
Wake up, America.
I wanna grow up and be a sacred mushroom, but right now I'm just a psychedelic mushroom spoon. And I know, good Lord Jesus knows, man, right now I can be oh so much more. And that's why I'm gonna hope, and that's why I'm gonna pray, yeah. I grow up and be a sacred mushroom one day. And then some good soul gonna come along and put me right in the belly. Yeah, that's what I'm